Welcome back to the Health Longevity Secret Show with Dr. Robert Lufkin. Epigenetic change is now recognized as the cumulative effect of our life experiences in controlling gene expression. What is less well known is that this epigenetic influence on our gene expression can extend back to our parents and even our grandparents' life experiences. Let's dive into this fascinating topic with today's guest expert. Judith Finlayson is a best-selling author who has written books on a variety of subjects, from personal well-being and women's history to food and nutrition. Her most recent book, entitled You Are What Your Grandparents Ate, is a revealing take on transgenerational epigenetics and has been translated into German, French, Spanish, Slovenian, and Japanese. Before we begin, I would like to mention that this show is separate from my teaching and research roles at the medical school with which I am currently affiliated. It is, however, part of my continuing effort to bring quality, evidence-based information about health and longevity to the general public. Now, please enjoy this interview with Judith Finlayson. Judith Finlayson, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
Yes, I'm a big fan of your book. You Are What Your Grandparents Ate: What You Need to Know About Nutrition, Experience, Epigenetics, and the Origins of Chronic Disease. I'm so excited to talk to you about this and understand what you've learned about writing this book. But before we do that, perhaps we could take a moment and just tell us how you got to be interested in this fascinating area.
Well, I've always been interested, well, not always, but for the past 20 years or so, I've been very interested in nutrition and health. And so somebody gave me a number of years ago a copy of a little book called Nutrition in the Womb, and it was a self-published book written by Dr. David Barker, a British epidemiologist. And I now know that this was kind of the framework that the whole developmental origins of health and disease sprung from. But at the time I didn't. I read it though, and I was really knocked out by it, because basically what he was saying is that our health, much of our health and much chronic illness originates from what happened to us while we were still in the womb. And this was really, I had never known that. I mean, you know that, pregnant women should eat well and take care of themselves, but I didn't realize a lot of the mechanics of it. So I started asking around, people like my doctor, or whenever I'd be at a party and, there'd be a lot of doctors or medical people. And I would say to them, well, what do you think about the developmental origins of health and disease and Dr. David Barker? And they'd never heard of him. So I thought, holy smoke, this is really, a very important thing, and nobody knows about it. So anyway, You Are What Your Grandparents Ate is the end result of a couple of years of really researching that and going into it and talking in great depth to a lot of the people that he worked with, some of whom initially thought he was nuts, but when they started to work with data, found out that he was actually on the right track.
So I have to admit, before I read the book, I was not aware of Dr. David Barker. Who was he?
Well, David Barker was a British epidemiologist, and he died, I think, in 2013. But he was in the 70s engaged in a mammoth epidemiological project called the Atlas of Mortality. And as you know, epidemiologists study patterns of disease in groups, large groups of people. And what he was seeing was really going against the grain of conventional wisdom. because in those days, I mean, now that we know a lot about the social origins of health and disease, it's not quite as radical an idea, but in those days, they really thought that heart disease was a disease of affluence. It was linked, you know, it was a male disease. It was linked with eating too much meat. His data was showing that rates of heart disease were actually much higher in the poorer parts of Britain. And this really bothered him. He then, when he started aligning information, could see that in these areas where maternal mortality and high rates of infant mortality could also be linked with high rates of heart disease and stroke 70 years later, mortality from heart disease and stroke. So he began to suspect that this was really about something that was going on during pregnancy, but he had no data to substantiate that. He needed detailed birth records of what happened during pregnancy and the first year of birth. He found these in something called the Hertfordshire Ledgers, which were around the turn of the 20th century. The British health was very, very poor, and the government looked into studying it and funded a remarkable woman named E. Margaret Burnside, who's one of the most interesting characters in this whole study, who is the chief inspector of health visitors and midwives, and rode her bicycle around England. But she documented, she and her workers created records that documented women's pregnancies. They visited the homes of people out in the country and wherever, and what happened during the first year of birth, or life rather. And Dr. Barker was able to use that data to develop what was called at that point the Barker hypothesis, which was published in the Lancet in 1986. And he could link babies born with low birth weight with significantly higher rates of heart disease as adults. And that was the beginning of the science that we now know as the developmental origins of health and disease. And there are thousands and thousands of studies now that really show how what happens in the womb influences the development of chronic illness later in life.
It's fascinating that he, as an epidemiologist, made an observation in his data, and the field of epigenetics and all was still very early, if at all, along, and there wasn't really an explanation for it yet, and only later on was this applied as a possible biological medical explanation for it. That's fascinating.
That's absolutely correct. The first studies began to look at how things like poor nutrition affect organ development. So when the fetus is developing, the placenta is controlling the delivery of nutrients and oxygen to the fetus. If there isn't enough nutrition, the placenta will adjust in some way, but you know, there is a point where it can't, if there isn't enough, there's nothing more it can do. And so the fetus will begin, there's a kind of hierarchy of development. It will begin trading off organ development, beginning with things like, say, the kidneys, which it doesn't need because the mother's body does that work for it. So poor nutrition and chronic stress is also another one of these big impacts. Really begins by affecting organ development before you get into the science of epigenetics. The science of epigenetics as I think you probably know, really began to come to the fore in all of this in the late 1990s with the agouti mouse study. And that really showed that by improving the nutrition of these poor little agouti mice who had been bred to be beautiful, but in being beautiful, they had been transgenerationally passing along these genes that didn't work as well as they ought to have. By supplementing with certain B vitamins and a couple of other things, they were able to improve the health not only of the first and second generations, but without further supplementation of subsequent offspring in the following generations. So that was really a key study that showed how you could improve health by long-term health by improving nutrition.
Yeah, so for our listener, or for our audience, the genetics is at first pass the information we receive from our parents and our ancestors, and epigenetics is the information that we receive from our life experiences. But it's actually more nuanced than that, isn't it? It's not that exactly cut off there.
It's true. So the epigenetics is a bit more complicated to explain. But let's start with reproductive cells. So you have the sperm and the egg. It's easier to see in the egg development because we tend to forget, but a female is born with all of her eggs. So her eggs are developing while she is still in her mother's womb. Now, remember Dr. Barker talking about how the origins of chronic illness often really were seated in the womb. When you think about these eggs forming, it's very easy to see that the air her mother breathes, the food she eats, the stress she experiences is going to affect the quality of those eggs. And it does that by leaving, the easy way to remember is biological memories. So these are really epigenetic modifications, but it's easier, I think, to remember it as a biological memory. So, you know, it's easy to say, if you get a whack, you get a bruise. It's the same kind of thing, but it's affecting the expression of your genes because it's leaving these biological memories on them. With males, it's a little trickier to see, but they too, and there is now an emerging subset of the developmental origins of health and disease called the paternal origins of health and disease, where they are really beginning to look at the impact of males on reproductive development, which is really more than we would have thought. So we can't blame everything on mother anymore. Father did have some input to this. With boys, these epigenetic memories, biological memories, are the key developmental period is around the time that sperm cells are forming. So around the time of puberty. And when Dr. Barker was doing his original work, about the same time, there was a Swedish epidemiologist named Lars Bergen, who was looking at his little town in Sweden where his family had lived for hundreds of years. And for some reason decided to study the impact of feast or famine. It's an agricultural community, so some years they had a lot to eat, other years they had very little. And he found that when boys ate too much around the time of puberty, their grandsons were more likely to die significantly younger than the control group who ate normally. He tried to get that work published, and even though the peer-reviewed journals agreed that his statistics were very sound. They just said, this is too wonky. We can't publish this. So he kind of hung around, but he knew he was right. He was a bit like Dr. Barker. Eventually paired up with a British geneticist named Marcus Penbury, who was studying some diseases and beginning to think that there was more than just the transmission of genes. That there was something, because they were getting the same disease or different diseases from the same genes, but depending on whether they had been transmitted through the male or the female line. So when the two of them teamed up, because then they were able to begin publishing that portion of the work, which was looking at things like the impact of cigarette smoking was another one. If young boys started to smoke around the time of puberty, their sons and grandsons were more likely to be obese. So that was kind of where that wing of everything got going. But so you have these two reproductive cells then that are being influenced by the experiences of the mother and father who provided them. And then they are influenced by the experiences of the mother when she is pregnant. And all of that sets the stage for the kind of epigenetic modifications to gene expression. So what I like to say is that we have good news. I have good news and I have bad news. And the bad news is that to some extent your health is determined before you were born. But the good news, and this is why it's important to really get these messages out, is that once you start making your own choices regarding lifestyle modifications, like exercising, eating a healthy diet, you can change the expression of genes that may not be functioning optimally to improve how they function. And there are now lots of studies that are showing that.
Yes, yeah, the power of lifestyle to affect epigenetic change is really remarkable, and it's something that we all hopefully take advantage of. You mentioned some of the things that affected the fetus or the gametes, actually, things like the parent or grandparent smoking and diet choices. What other types of things have you found that will affect the epigenetics of later generations?
Well, things like obesity. Women who are obese tend to have inflamed placentas, and that is transmitted to the fetus, therefore predisposing the baby to some diseases. Toxins, of course, we have the horrible DEA experience of a drug that was given to women, and their daughters developed this rare type of cancer. And now, I mean, they're beginning to see this through the generations. It's also affecting the second generation offspring, and they believe that it's also affecting some male offspring. This is happening. Is the last time I looked at it was developing research, but it was coming onto the horizon. So, toxic exposures, lifestyle modifications, certainly, getting an adequate amount of exercise is very important to establishing positive epigenetic patterns. It's just, basically it's complex science, but it's really the kind of common sense. It's your grandmother's or great grandmother's, message. Healthy food, lots of exercise. Mindfulness is interesting too. They're now being able to show that things like, I don't know if they've ever looked, I haven't seen any studies that have actually looked at its effect on the fetus, but it has certainly looked at the effect on your own gene expression. So things like yoga, mindfulness modification do improve gene expression in ways that improve your health.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Now I can get my head around the way you've explained it. Through the egg cells and the sperm cells, sort of going back 2 generations. And I know in the literature there's some evidence for, at least in animal models like C. elegans and all, that these epigenetic changes possibly go back even further. Are there any mechanisms for that? How do you think about that effect?
Well, I suspect that that's probably true. As you say, most of the science really does only look at 2 generations, but they leave the door open for the fact that it's much longer. I can't remember his name, but was it Lanark, the fellow who talked about
the Russian Lamarck? Yes,
giraffes and the giraffe's neck, and his theory was that the giraffe had developed this long neck because it had to reach up to eat the leaves, and then eventually this long neck was passed along to subsequent generations, and everybody thought he was crazy. But they're now saying maybe not, so, there's so much that we don't know. And we just try to stick to what we do know in terms of evidence-based medicine. But, and since there is so much silliness out there, I think the only thing that you can do is try to control it and look at it in terms of evidence-based medicine. But there's possibly a lot that we're not really looking at as well, or missing. So you just have to keep it out there, and maybe someday.
Yes, absolutely. I think I misspoke. I don't believe Lamarck is Russian, but we'll find out in the show notes. We'll have a reference for that. So all of these factors, these exposures, these behaviors, these lifestyle changes can affect our children or our grandchildren. And what sort of ways are these effects manifested? What sort of chronic diseases? What is the price we pay 2 generations later for behavior by our parents and grandparents?
Well, they're mostly metabolic, although they are showing up in things like cancer and so on as well. One of the stories that I really like to talk about is the 100-year effect, because I think we're really seeing it now in the very high incidences of chronic disease. And epidemiologists are now beginning to see the studies that are suggesting that the current generation of young people will be the first not to live longer than their parents. And you can really put that into the perspective of the westernized standard American diet. And it really came to the fore in the 1950s, or started to come to the fore in the 1950s. So you have 3 generations of Americans, or people who live a westernized diet or eat a westernized diet, who are suffering from what has been described as high calorie malnutrition because processed foods don't have enough nutrients. And they also have, I mean, the other side of that coin is they also have a lot of additives that are probably not good for you as well. But you can just stick to the absence of nutrients and particularly fiber. We can talk about the microbiome a little later. But what you have, say, is somebody who came of age in the 50s, ate a lot of processed food. She then gets pregnant. Her eggs are not going to be as robust as they ought to be from eating a malnourished diet on through now 3 generations. So you can really look at the impact of that in the high rates of chronic illnesses like type 2 diabetes, like obesity. You know, there are so many people who say they can't lose weight. And I believe a lot of them. There are people who say, you know, they look at a carb and they gain weight. But, you know, why is that the case? And if you look back, it's because their metabolisms have been programmed for it because of these generations of processed foods. And so that's kind of the 100-year effect, because if you go back to the eggs, the egg that made you was formed in your mother's womb or in your grandmother's womb. So you have this 100-year effect of poor nutrition, of sedentary lifestyles. And we're really seeing it in high rates of metabolic illnesses. And now in shortened lifespans for younger generations of people.
Yes, and as we've talked about before on the show, we're now understanding that these metabolic abnormalities at a foundational level manifest as a variety of different chronic diseases that we used to think were completely unrelated, but now we know that have this metabolic underpinning, things like heart disease, stroke, dementia, cancer, diabetes, obesity, fatty liver disease. It's really a very complicated effect with many inputs, but this epigenetic phenomenon and the effect of processed foods on our diets can't be underestimated. It's wow.
Well, you know, can we talk a little bit about the microbiome?
Yes,
Because
yes.
talk about processed foods, which are notoriously, you know, devoid of fiber. They really affect the microbiome. And the microbiome is certainly, I think, a new frontier in health. And it's kind of the other end of the developmental origins of health and disease. But processed foods are notoriously empty of nutrients and of fiber that encourage the development of a healthy microbiome. The microbiome, we now, I spend a lot of time researching that at the moment, and it's hard to see that it isn't linked with every possible disease you could imagine. I mean, I think if there isn't a study today, there will be one tomorrow. But it really affects your mental health, because 90% of the serotonin and those other feel-good hormones are produced in your gut. Most of your immune system is located in your gut. And, you know, autoimmune diseases are another. I mean, we talk about the raft or the epidemic of metabolic diseases, but autoimmune diseases are real comers in that sense as well. We know that a processed food diet, Tim Spector, who's a scientist who works in this area, his son wanted to do this. He thought he'd died and gone to heaven. Could he eat processed food for 10 days? So his father said, okay, but I'm going to test you. So he was busy testing his son's stool every day, and it was amazing how quickly the robustness of his son's microbiome declined. After 10 days, more than 50% of the diversity of the species had been lost. And after, I think, 5 or 6 days, even the kid was saying, I'm not sure I want to finish this. I feel so terrible. But we know that processed food is not good for you. And the microbiome and its effect on the microbiome is certainly one of the ways that we can see that in a very concrete way.
Yeah, and just for our audience to be clear, by microbiome, we're focusing on the gut microbiome, and people are looking at the sinus microbiome, and Dale Bredesen's looking at the brain microbiome, but the gut microbiome is by far the largest number of microbes, and it's one of the most thoroughly studied. Perhaps, Judith, you could talk a little bit about the microbiome, just to bring the gut microbiome, just to bring our listeners up to speed. We hear a lot of, you talk about fiber, we hear macrobiotics, prebiotics, probiotics. What is necessary for gut microbiome health?
Well, we haven't actually defined the perfectly healthy microbiome, and it probably differs from person to person, because we are finding different. I mean, in Africa, they have huge numbers of H. pylori and bacteria, and if we had the same numbers in ours, we'd all be very sick. So I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but it's kind of a universal thing that it depends on all kinds of other things too. But what we do know is that diversity is important. The larger number, we have good bacteria. Maybe we should start by saying we have good bacteria and bad bacteria in our guts. And the important thing is to have the good guys in charge. So you want more good guys than bad guys. And you know that you can encourage the growth of good guys by eating nutritious foods, mostly plant foods. The studies have shown that the healthiest gut microbiomes are linked with the high consumption of plant foods. Things like omega-3 fatty acids, which we tend to get from fish, we can get them from plants, and this is something that interests me, because the translation of those fats from plants into EPA or DHA or EPA in your gut is notoriously poor. But my gut instinct is that I think we're going to find that if people have healthy gut microbiomes to start with, that it will be better. But for the moment, the way to really get your beneficial omega-3s is through mostly through oily fish, and those do not directly nourish the bacteria. Thrive by eating the components of plant foods. There are a number of them. We probably don't fully understand all of the ones that are good for your beneficial bacteria, but the two we really know about are fiber and plant polyphenols, and they really do these. They love it, and they reproduce, and they create wonderful metabolites like short chain fatty acids, which do great things in your body, like fight inflammation. help to keep your immune system strong. The healthy fats, on the other hand, do not necessarily directly feed the bacteria, but they provide, it appears that they provide a friendly environment which helps them to flourish. So it's basically a healthy diet, exercising, getting enough exercise, not having a sedentary lifestyle also helps to keep your microbiome healthy. So, you know, just that's an important thing, and not eating processed foods. They don't like processed foods. So healthy, happy little bacteria that keep you feeling well.
Yes, and we just had one of our experts was talking about the effect of artificial sweeteners on the gut microbiome, how people switch from their favorite sugar, soda, Coke or Pepsi to Diet Coke or Pepsi, thinking that, you know, they're dodging a bullet, but actually the artificial sweeteners can wreak havoc on the gut microbiome also there. So it's a lot of challenges.
In terms of developing, you know, with the healthy microbiome, that one of the big discussions now is whether the microbiome is seeded while you're still in the womb or not. And that's a very hot topic. The idea, originally they said absolutely not. They're now saying probably a little bit. But, you know, we don't know how much, if at all. But the way to, you know, if you have a vaginal birth, that is a big help toward building a healthy biome. And they're now looking at trying to support more microbiome, you know, universal microbiome robustness in babies that are born by C-section. But also breastfeeding is another big off to a healthy microbiome start, because it contains prebiotics that support the growth of beneficial bacteria. And you asked about prebiotics, probiotics, symbiotics, and there now are even postbiotics. And those are the various healthy bacteria things. The prebiotics are the components in food that nourish the beneficial bacteria in your gut. Probiotics are healthy bacteria that you can either find in fermented foods or take as a supplement. Symbiotics are taking you know, eating, say something like, I take a spoonful of flaxseed every morning at breakfast. So that's a very good prebiotic. But I also take a probiotic containing bifidobacteria because I have a wonky gene variation and don't produce enough of bifidobacteria myself. So I give it a little boost with this symbiotic in the morning. And then you have postbiotics, which are the new kid on the block. And they're really looking at, those are the metabolites that the beneficial bacteria produce, like short chain fatty acids, but they're now trying to get them to you in supplements.
Yeah, that's interesting, all the different combinations. I guess no discussion of the gut microbiome and all the probiotics, prebiotics, symbiotics, postbiotics would be complete with it, at least without at least mentioning antibiotics. And we need to be very judicious about our use of antibiotics, because even a short course of antibiotics for bronchitis can dramatically alter our gut microbiome, and in fact the microbiome of all our bodies. So we all need to look very carefully at that. It's so funny, when I went to medical school so many years ago, microbes and germs were felt to be something that were bad, universally bad, and we had to get rid of them. You know, we dealt with sterility in the operating room and all these things now. And our thinking, like so many things in medicine, has transformed dramatically, so that, like you say, Judith, we realize there are good microbes and bad microbes, and it's not all or nothing. It's about managing the populations and creating a positive environment for that. Maybe in our last few moments, if you wouldn't mind, we always like to ask our expert guests, given your expertise, the knowledge that you know about epigenetics and risk factors and lifestyle and the effects on chronic disease, I wonder what choices you make in your personal lifestyle as far as diet, exercise, and that sort of thing. You've mentioned a few things, but could you elaborate?
Well, I like to think I've had a healthy lifestyle for most of my adult life. I started exercising seriously when I was in my early 30s, and have maintained that with regular gym sessions, strength training, and I do Pilates once or twice a week, an hour-long session. And I find that I don't know how I'd function without that. I also really, I'm a bit of a zealot about a nutritious diet, and I probably would go hungry rather than eat processed food. So, because I know so much about it, and I know how awful it is, and I also know that, I have enough fat in my body or enough nutrients in my body that if I missed a meal, I wouldn't die. But in the morning, I start my morning off usually with a glass of fresh fruit juice, a big spoonful of sprouted ground flax seeds to nourish my friendly bacteria. And I put a spoonful of high EPA omega-3 fatty acids in my fruit juice. And that's how I start my day. And then a whole grain cereal, either hot oatmeal or an artisanal granola that I buy that's really good. And then for lunch, I often have homemade soup that I make with good bone broth, real bone broth, because bone broth is full of nutrients, and it's also very good for your gut. Or salad or poached eggs on a gluten-free whole grain toast, because I discovered, one of the other things I discovered in my journey is that I am gluten intolerant. And then I eat a normal dinner, but it's normal in the sense that I do eat meat, but I buy from a butcher. It's all pasture raised, sustainably. Same with my fish. I buy from a fishmonger. It's all wild caught or sustainably raised. And lots of fruits and vegetables. And I drink the occasional glass of wine, which I really enjoy. And I don't eat a lot of dessert. I was very fortunate in that I married a man who many years ago who does not have a sweet tooth, so I'm not often tempted. So and that's
Go ahead.
Oh, and I did a mindfulness meditation course a couple of years ago, and I try to work that into my life, although I have to work on a bit. I have trouble just stopping and trying to tell myself to focus on the moment.
Do you use any particular apps for your mindfulness to help you with that? And would you recommend the course to our audience?
I would recommend. Mine was done by, I live in Toronto, and by a psychologist who teaches it. But, find a person who's well qualified to teach it. And I do think it really, because it's a hard I never thought I would be able to do it because I'm someone who's always thinking. And you know, I've tried, you know, and the idea of sitting around and you know, kind of umming, it just never appealed to me. But doing the course, I went with a friend who wanted to do it. So she said she was going to do it. And I said, you know, I really should do that too. So I'll go with you. And it was, if I remember correctly, an 8-week course. And it trained me. It trained you to, and I don't quite know how to explain it, but it just being there and in an environment. There were about 8 people in the course, and it really helped me to learn to train my mind to focus. And then after it was over, I purchased, can I say, the Calm app, and so I have that when I travel. And if I'm feeling particularly stressed, I will listen to it before I go to sleep. And I do find it very helpful. And I now know that it's also improving my gene expression of certain genes. So it has a physical effect.
Yeah, many of our experts also use mindfulness meditation or Vipassana meditation. Using the Calm app is a great app. I recommend it also. Also Headspace or Waking Up by Sam Harris. 10% Happier. There's a number of them out there. Some of them are free also, but yeah, that's a very, very powerful tool. Also, many of our experts include part of their lifestyle intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding. Do you do any of that?
No, I don't. And not because I'm opposed to it, but you know, I find that I can maintain my weight and feel good and be healthy just doing what I'm doing. So I tend not to look at new things unless I feel there's something that I need to fix. And so far, I'm okay on that, but I wouldn't rule it out for future.
Yeah, that's the one.
It does seem to work, and I've read some studies on it, and it affects certain genes and whatever. So yeah.
That's the wonderful thing, that we're all different, and whatever, we all choose different paths in our lifestyle, that whatever works for us is what we do. And there are many different ways to achieve a healthy lifestyle that will support health and longevity. So how can our audience reach you, Judith? What's the best way for them to find out more about what you're doing and follow your work?
Well, I have a website, judithfinlayson.com, and so you can kind of see me there. I'm on Instagram. I post a lot on Instagram. Mostly it's kind of what I'm eating every day, with a little message about, you know, why it's good for you. That's about it.
Great. Well, we'll be following you, and I really recommend this book to our audience if you want to understand transgenerational epigenetics and the effect that we can all have on our children and grandchildren. Thank you so much, Judith, for being on the show today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Look forward to talking with you again soon.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye.
Note, this is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking of it because of something you have seen here. If you find this to be of value of you, please hit that like button and subscribe to support the work we do on this channel. Also, we take your suggestions and advice very seriously. Please let us know what you'd like to see on this channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll hope to see you next time.